going to be our presenter, and our chair, Judith Sikala, our PhD student, and our discussant is Dr. Nelly. So I will hand over to our chair, Dr. Judith. Sorry.
Soon to be Dr.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Cora. Welcome everyone to our Higher Education and Human Development BBT. So first, the speaker will give the presentation for 30 minutes. Following that, the discussion is approximately 10 minutes to respond. And the final 20 minutes will be open for question and answer. A few house rules for those who are online. Please keep microphones off during the presentation. Write your questions and comments in the chat box, and this will be raised during opening during the open question and answer session. So during the question and answer, participants are also very welcome to ask questions. To do so, please raise your hand and remember to switch your mic on when it's your turn to speak. I will be introducing our speaker of the day. And today we are having a speaker from the House, Dr. Edward Mboyonga. He is a postdoctoral research fellow in the Higher Education and Human Development Research Group at the University of the Free State, Bloemfontein, here in South Africa. He obtained his PhD in Development Studies, Higher Education and Human Development from the same university, a Master of Education from Trinity College, University of Dublin, Ireland, and a Bachelor of Education focusing on history from the University of Zambia. In 2019, he was a Fulbright Teaching Excellence and Achievement Fellow at Claremont Graduate University, California, USA. His research interests include, but are not limited to, higher education, access, human development, history, education, and Pan-Africanism. And the topic for today is Decolonizing and Humansing African Higher Education in the 21st Century, Perspectives from Kenneth Kaunda's Humanism philosophy. And here is the bio for our discussant, Dr. Nelly Mwale, a lecturer and researcher in the School of Education, Department of Religious Studies at the University of Zambia. Their research focuses on higher education, religion, gender, and indigenous knowledge systems and philosophy. Without much ado, I will hand over to our speaker.
Thank you very much, Judith, for the kind introduction. So as it was said, my presentation this afternoon focuses on decolonizing and humanizing African higher education in the 21st century. I'm drawing on the philosophy of humanism, which was espoused by Zambia's first president, Kenneth Kaunda. So this is just a brief outline of my presentation this afternoon. We'll open with a reflection, introduction, and all that will follow. So just a brief reflection. We'll open with the words of George Day in the Palgrave Handbook of African Education and Indigenous Knowledge. So George Day reminds us that though in the politics of futurity, we must confront the question of advancing new speculative imaginaries informed by our indigenous epistemies, including African-centered intellectual paradigms. Now, this is so that we envision new education and social futures for our communities. In this case, the 21st century Africa as our community. And Day goes on to say that, you know, we have a very rich intellectual tradition to assist the project of new futurity. So it is within these discourses that I locate Pan-Africanism, you know, as some kind of indigenous episteme that can help us to envision new education and social futures for our communities, for our countries, as well as for our African continent. So just a brief introduction and background to my paper, which is a theoretical paper. Now, in literature, of course, there is increased recognition of the value of African indigenous thoughts as well as Pan-Africanism. Now, these thoughts have been advanced as the only thoughts which are capable of advancing contextual solutions to the various developmental challenges affecting the continent. Of course, this is driven by the need for Afro-centered approaches to development. So there is a lot of literature which has criticized foreign aid, for instance. If you've read the book by Dambisa Moyo on dead aid, where she criticizes a foreign aid which comes to Africa, according to her, she argues that no, foreign aid actually is at the center of underdevelopment in Africa. And so she challenges African leaders, African scholars to come up with Afro-centered approaches to development. Currently, this, of course, has been animated by calls to decolonize knowledge systems, universities, and disciplines in Africa, but also beyond the African continent. Coming back also to the African continent, we find that Pan-Africanism and African Renaissance, they are also central in the African Union agenda, which is 2063. And so we see that the African Union agenda has further animated the cause for Pan-Africanism, African Renaissance. With regards to higher education, for instance, Agenda 2063, it underscores the role of higher education in addressing past injustice. At the same time, it recognizes the potential role of higher education in advancing human development on the continent by recognizing the current 21st century as the African century. Now, to do this, there is need, of course, for us to transform our education, for us to humanize our education, for us to decolonize our education. Just a brief history of Pan-African ideologies. Most of these ideologies, as Ndlovu Gassen argues, they emerge from the battlefields of the history for struggles of human dignity, for independence of Africa. I think this was mostly in the 1950s as well as the early 1960s. There are various forms of Pan-African ideologies. For instance, Kwame Nkrumah focused on conscientization in Ghana. Julius Nyerere focused on Ujama in Tanzania. Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya focused on Harambee. Others, such as Leopold Sédar Senghor of Senegal, Sékou Touré, they also advanced different forms of Pan-Africanism. But historian Paul Tiambe Zeleze reminds us that despite the variances in these ideologies, a commonality or the base in all these was in what he terms the four eras. The four eras, which is one, the struggle to retain existing African sovereignties, to reform colonialism, remove colonialism, and recreate independence. So within the current discourses of decolonization, I argue in my draft paper that Pan-African ideologies, theoretically, they have the potential to contribute to the current discourses on decolonization, or they add value to post-colonial frameworks which are aimed at restoring and reclaiming the Africanacity. Africanacity in this sense refers to the African values, customs, identities, beliefs, and so on of Africans, both within the continent as well as those in the diaspora. Now, most of the people, when they talk of Pan-Africanism, the mistake they make is removing the diaspora. The diaspora is an essential ingredient of Pan-Africanism because its development actually it was much more from the diaspora scholars like Garvey and others, Du Bois and others. However, in literature, I've realized again that despite a growing body of scholarship on the role of Pan-African philosophies in transforming as well as decolonizing higher education to meet Africa's development aspirations, there has been little academic focus on Kenneth Kaunda's scholarship on Pan-Africanism, specifically on humanism. Most of the scholarship focuses on Kwame Nkrumah mostly, as well as Simon's president, Julius Nyerere, Ujama, and his ideologies. So I argue in my paper that Kenneth Kaunda's philosophy of humanism is or should be considered as part of the broader Pan-African intellectual history that aims to decolonize the various facets of African society, in this case, including higher education. So the main research questions, of course, are two. The first one basically is how can Pan-African ideologies contribute to current discourses on decolonizing and humanizing African higher education? Specifically, I fuse in Kenneth Kaunda's humanism and seek to examine how it can be appropriated in African universities to make them more relevant as well as responsive to the priorities, challenges, and the realities of the African people. So just a brief on the terms as I try to unpack some of these terms. Now, decolonization is a very much contested concept within the academic terrain. There are various definitions, but I think a general agreement within scholarship is that it aims at recognizing and bringing into existence agency, voice, as well as history of those who were marginalized due to European colonialism, as well as the current imperialism, neo-imperialism, which is taking place either in economy, in knowledge production, and so on. And it is for this reason that scholars such as Gatsen Lovu argues that, when we talk of decolonization or the decoloniality project, it is both an epistemic as well as a political project which seeks to liberate and to free those people who experience colonialism. Then quickly, when we talk of humanizing, again, I borrow the term humanizing education from Takako Mino, who argues that when we talk of humanizing education, we are talking of cultivating an appreciation for the dignity of life in each individual. So in this case, individuals within higher education context, it will be students and lecturers, so that we awaken in them their role in contributing to the lives of others in a meaningful way. And I argue in my paper that, imparting humanist values in higher education is necessary, especially in addressing the numerous challenges which we are facing in our communities today. Challenges such as racism, challenges such as gender-based violence, challenges such as sexual harassment, all these vices which are affecting human dignity and our society. It is, in my humble opinion, that they can be addressed partly by humanizing our current higher education system. And this is not new. Of course, it has been central in the arguments of various philosophers, such as Pestalozzi, John Dewey, Paulo Freire. If you read Pedagogy of the Oppressed, I think that is a recurring theme. But also, this is central to our own works here as the higher education and human development centers. We research on your issues of well-being, social justice, decolonization, and other social justices. It is central to our current work. And so just a brief also on Kenneth Kaunda's humanism. For those of you who might not know Kenneth Kaunda, he was the first president of Zambia who ruled from 1964 at a time when Zambia got its independence from Britain until 1991. And so he introduced humanism as a moral or a national moral code to guide all nations' activities in Zambia, be it political activities, economic activities, social spheres, including education provision. So within education, for instance, humanism was taught in schools. It was made part and parcel of the teacher education curriculum. In higher education, it was also practiced through avenues like the compulsory participation in the national youth services, the introduction of the Center for Human Studies at the University of Zambia, the introduction of the Rural Research Bureau at the University of Zambia. So all those was done in order to attune higher education in line with the needs of the local communities. So in essence, it aimed at departing from the inherited colonial societies by forging an African identity anchored on an egalitarian society. And within higher education, I argue in my paper that humanism aspired to produce socially responsive public good-oriented graduates, and these public good-oriented graduates were to be equipped with human values to drive the national development agenda within the newly independent country. We might be wondering, so what were the characteristics of this humanism? So Kaunda identified 8 central tenets of humanism, which I think if we apply them to higher education, they add significant value. So the first one, of course, was the dignity of the human being. That is the human person at the center, dignity of the human person, the non-exploitation. It called for equal opportunities for all, regardless of races, regardless of economic classes. It called for hard work and self-reliance. It called for working together. Jomo Kenyatta would call this Arambe, putting together. It called for the extended family as well as loyalty and patriotism. So humanism drew from the values of African indigenous social systems, but also from socialism and Christian teachings. Specifically Christian teachings, they had a profound influence on the life of Kaunda because his parents came from Malawi to Zambia as missionaries. So it had a very big impact on his life. So the picture you see there was during Humanism Week in 1977, where nurses and some nursing students were doing community service work. So this was a part of humanism. Now, what is the relevance of Kaunda's humanism to decolonizing and humanizing African higher education in the 21st century? So I suggest that humanism adds value to the current discourses on decolonization and humanizing African higher education in 4 major ways, not limited to these, of course. And the first one is that of its focus on the centrality of human beings, which is Ubuntu, equality of opportunities, education for self-reliance, as well as its appreciation for indigenous knowledge system. I will quickly elaborate on these 4. So when we talk of the centrality of human beings, here some scholars like Lumumba Kasongo, they argue that Ubuntu and Pan-Africanism, these are complementary philosophies. Why? Humanism, for instance, it teaches people to rebuild the human society based on positive forces. And these positive forces are the characteristics of Ubuntu. We talk of the forces of love, truth, social justice, fair play, and harboring things like ethnicity, gender discrimination, color, and class lines. So we see that humanism in itself, it advocates for Ubuntu. And because of this, humanism was antithetical to materialism. Kaunda, discouraged the aspect of consumerization of human beings, customization of human beings. Now, it is unfortunate in the current higher education system that the aspect of consumerization and customization has eroded the higher education system, where students, for instance, has been turned into customers, into consumers. They're not seen as human beings, but as customers and as consumers within this knowledge producing economy. And this is why scholars like Ashley Mbembe argues that if we are to decolonize the current higher education system, to decolonize then implies the need to break the cycle that tends to turn students into customers and consumers. So I argue that, this can be eliminated, this can be achieved through the elimination of pedagogical approaches, and as well as curriculum contents that dehumanize and objectifize our students. And the teaching of humanism here, it is central because with its focusing on positive forces of social justice, of truth, of love, of equality, we can then empower our students with the knowledge and the values, but also provide them with opportunities to address various structural oppressions in their societies. And then when we talk of equal opportunities, Kaunda, through humanism, he argued that a humanist nation must be able to reduce those inequalities which rob people of their life chances. And so that's why during the time of Kaunda, higher education, for instance, was free because access to higher education was seen as the right of the citizens. It was seen as a way of attaining equality, especially when one considers that during colonialism in Zambia and most African system, access to higher education was mostly characterized by the racial bars. So the moment Kaunda came into power, he outlawed such laws and made education opened up education institutions for all, regardless of the races. But what is also interesting is that humanism recognized the public good role of higher education. And because of that, there was sustainable funding. Yeah, in his thesis, Yunza scholar Ferdinand Chipindi argues that during Kaunda's reign, despite the economic challenges, the University of Zambia at least enjoyed a share of public funding from Kaunda's UNIP government. So that just goes to show the recognition of higher education in terms of availing equal opportunities for all. So applied to the current discourses on decolonization, my argument here that acknowledging universities' role in addressing social inequalities is not enough without paying necessary attention to sustainable funding. And so the aspirations for most of the African universities to transform, to capture the 21st century as the century of the African will remain elusive if it is not accompanied by sustainable funding, especially on the parts of the government. Not that Kaunda's time they had money, but it was a matter of priorities. Nowadays, if we read most of the newspapers in African countries, we see a lot of corruption that goes in the funding of higher education institutions. But during the reign of humanism, that was not the thing. So humanism challenges us in that mindset. Then the third one is that of education for self-reliance. Here again, it relates to aligning the curriculum to address local needs, but also locally driven initiatives to fund developmental projects, including education. This also speaks to the aspect of funding that there is a need to try as much as possible to be sustainable, to be self-reliant for Africa in funding its education system. Kaunda also, in terms of aligning the curriculum to local needs, he argued that the type of education Zambia needs, like any other developing country, is education for development, education that meets the special needs of our people, meaning that we need to align the higher education system with the needs of the people. Zambia right now has experienced a drought which has been declared as a national disaster. The question then is, what is the role of the higher education institutions in this, in mitigating such droughts, in coming up with measures that would discern or that will make governments to quickly know that, okay, there will be a drought in 6 months. That is where higher education can come in to address the needs of the local people, and not just for the purpose of utility, not just to equip students with the technicals to solve problems, not just the education that will give students, as Kaunda will say, romantic satisfaction, but practical utility, meeting the needs of the community. Then the other aspect of self-reliance, Kaunda emphasizes the need for us to take agency in sustainable knowledge creation. For instance, he bemoaned the epistemic denial of African knowledge system by arguing that the African has never really been allowed by non-Africans to be African in both thought and deed. So this poses a challenge to scholars today. You know, we need to take agency in terms of our own knowledge creation. If we look at most of the journals, for instance, Journal of African Studies, who are the editors? Who are the specialists? You go to Harvard University, Oxford, Cambridge, who are the specialists in African geography, in African higher education? You find that most of this knowledge is written by people who are not mostly Africans. And in Kaunda's sense, that would be equated to the epistemic denial of African knowledge, but also it challenges us to take agency by looking at indigenous values, by appreciating our indigenous values. So when we talk of indigenous values, scholars have argued that IK should institute the bedrock of post-colonial curriculum. Others again, like George Day, they've argued that we cannot discuss African education without situating indigenous knowledge at the center. And this is where humanism adds value to the current discourses on humanizing and decolonizing African higher education, because it recognized traditional values as alternative knowledge systems for fostering development in Zambia, in Africa. So within the current terminologies, we would say Kaunda, through humanism, also advocated for the plural diversity of knowledge system, and this aligns, of course, with the decolonial agenda. What was also interesting about Kaunda is that he was critical of the university education that focused more on training students to take up technical, professional, and scientific roles, but neglected courses like African arts, culture, and languages, which he considered central in fostering national building. And we see this also in the African Union agenda. This is central. We see this also in the current discourses on sustainable development. And it is interesting, and also it is home-hearting to see that universities quickly, they are trying to appreciate indigenous knowledge system by introducing different courses. University of Zambia, for instance, has a course on intangible cultural heritage. Various South African universities have centers for indigenous medicine. In Uganda, there is also another university which has a center for indigenous knowledge system. So we see this appreciation of indigenous knowledge. By advocating for the need for African arts, cultures, and languages, Kaunda actually was even influential in the introduction of a drama course as part of the African literature at the University of Zambia in 1970. Prior to that, it was only literature in English. But because of humanism, because of the need, because of Kaunda's interest in African culture, languages, and arts, there was this introduction of the African literature at University of Zambia in the 1970s. So quickly, what then is the conclusion? Okay, before I conclude my thoughts, I would want to state here that Kaunda's humanism, of course, like any other ideology, was not perfect. It had its own limitation. And some scholars have argued that one of the major limitations was that this ideology was mostly personalized. It was not just Kaunda, but it was also the same with the likes of Nkrumah, with the likes of Julius Nyerere. And for this reason, scholars such as Tandika Mkandawire, he refers this group of Pan-African scholars as philosophical kings. They termed themselves, or they called themselves philosophical kings. And because of that, it brought crashes with the university intellectuals. You know, there was those conflicts with between these Pan-African philosophers, philosophical kings, and the intellectuals. For the university intellectuals, they didn't see any real theory in this humanism. They argued that, you know, it is just utopia. And Kaunda himself recognizes that indeed humanism has been criticized for its utopian nature. But again, Pan-African scholars like Lumumba Kasongo, he gives us hope that, you know, utopianism is still relevant today, especially if we believe in building a society based on social justice, a society based on gender equality and freedom. Utopianism is still relevant. And this is what gives me hope to conclude that humanism, therefore, still offers a theoretical foundation in rethinking the value of university education in meeting Africa's societal needs. The principles of humanism can therefore help the African continent in producing socially responsible but public good-oriented graduates who are equipped with human values to drive our developmental aspirations in meeting the Agenda 2063. So in conclusion, I'll just end with this excerpt which I got from the University of Zambia library. It is an excerpt from Kaunda's speech as the first chancellor of the University of Zambia, which was opened in 1963. Here, it challenges us that do not become so wrapped in your studies that you forget the people from whom you have sprung. Important as your studies are, education is of little value if you lose the human touch. Education is a great boon, but it can also be a great curse if it creates an elite of Black gentlemen, I add, or women, remote from the masses, conscious of only what society owes them, not what they owe society. Kaunda goes on to say that the sacrifices of the people of this country would be in vain if the university they struggled to produce graduates whose only thought was self and not service. The elite we want to foster is one which is more concerned with its responsibilities than its rights. An elite dedicated to the noble task of nation building, however humble the demand. So as you walk through the corridors of academic autonomy, know that there are men, women, and children who will never be lifted from their lowly position without your help. And this is a challenge which Kaunda poses to each one of us in this room, as well as those who are online. So I end here. I would say zikomo kwambiri kialeboa na totela sana. Questions and comments are welcome.
Thank you very much for such a great presentation.
What is Kaunda blessing me? Positionality.
Yeah, that was a great presentation. I will hand over to our discussant. Over to you, Dr. Mwale.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
We can hear you.
Okay. Allow me to turn off to improve the quality.
You can
thank
turn
you.
off the video.
Okay, I can proceed.
Yes, you are coming in and out, but we can hear you now. You can go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. So may I greet you in a very special way, and let me begin by expressing my gratitude to be part of this brown bag talk presentation. I'm very delighted and honored to have the opportunity to share my thoughts on the presentation that has just been made. Very insightful, very interesting, and thanks to the organizers for this session as well. Thank you, Edward, and for ending the presentation on that blessing note. It gives the presentation its own touch and its own meaning. But thank you very much for this paper, which comes in a special year because, as you may be aware, Zambia will be celebrating her 60th independence anniversary on October 24 this year. So for me, this is a good opportunity to reflect on what lessons we can retrieve from the past for the good of the continent in this century. So I'll give a very brief analysis in terms of how I approach this paper and then dive into my impressions of the paper and then share some thoughts for reflection or consideration. I'll go stage by stage, but I'll try to be brief in the interest of time. So how do I come to this paper that has just been presented? I approach this paper firstly from one with an interest in African indigenous worldviews. And to this, my teaching, my research areas, they revolve around retrieving African indigenous worldviews in ways that reclaim our identity as people. I'm also a student of Zambian history, in which my previous studies have interrogated the role of missionaries in the dislodge of colonialism. And this is a conversation that sheds light on Kenneth Kaunda's role in interaction with the church, which contributed to the birth of the new nation, which is Zambia. And most importantly, my interest in higher education, that is private higher education in post-1990 Zambia, brings me in conversation with the very agenda of Zambianization and its implications on higher education in Zambia. So I read the paper, I followed the presentation with a keen interest because the current terrain of higher education is one that I experience not only but also as my area of. What are some of the general impressions on the paper and the presentation? So generally, I think I should firstly commend Edward for choosing to focus on this subject because theoretical and empirical studies are limited, but also this subject of humanism in everyday conversations in Zambia is often associated with the older generation. So when you see young people going back in time to look at these issues, for me, that's a sign that points to a narrative of searching for ways of retrieving indigenous solutions to our societal problems, including those in higher education. I also appreciate the approach that Edward has chosen on decolonization because I think the discourse on decolonization should be able to bring out the voices and experiences of the people who were colonized in order to be in conversation with indigenous knowledge worldviews, but also to converse with alternative worldviews. And although the methodology that he adopts in the paper has not been intentionally tied to the research approaches and designs characteristic of indigenous knowledge systems, I find his use of secondary sources to be appropriate given the nature of the issue at hand, but also because you go out, you go back in time with new eyes of wanting to rewrite something, to make out something new out of what already exists. Let me now turn to what I consider as my points for further reflection or discussion in this presentation. So firstly, the paper well acknowledges Kaunda's long history in that he has not been a subject of focus in many instances. And with that, I would have appreciated a detailed account of the context in which Kaunda lived and worked, the context of his life, the context of his leadership, also the context of the national aspirations, so that when we appreciate the context in which he was working from, we may be able to see how that past context and the 21st century context relate to each other, so that if there are challenges that are similar, if there are challenges that have changed, we may be able to respond appropriately. So I was looking out for that. And then secondly, it is clear that in all the 27 years of Kaunda's rule as president, he promoted this humanism. And just a point of reflection in your view, how should we distinguish Kaunda's humanism from Marxism, from socialism, and perhaps by extension, how should we distinguish this from Christianity and Zambian traditional religion? How do we draw these lines? I think it is important to reflect on this, because if humanism was a blend of certain isms in the case of Kaunda, then it becomes imperative for us, or for indeed Edward, to propose what could be deemed as a workable philosophy that decolonizes and at the same time responds to the current challenges of the continent through higher education. I was just looking out for that. And then thirdly, I like the way you speak of the tenets of humanism, especially the 8 central principles of Zambian humanism. And I'm wondering, what should humanized African higher education look like based on these tenets? Are we able to paint a picture or to get a snapshot of what we envision based on these tenets that we have put up, so that we may be able to map out what can be considered as a decolonized and humanized higher education? And then fourthly, when you speak about self-reliance in relation to the curriculum and funding, I totally agree that the curriculum is perhaps easy to deal with, but the major issue for me seems to be funding. And to put it well, I agree that for as long as funding in higher education is not homegrown, there'll be very little to write about or to talk about humanizing higher education. So from where you stand, what financing models which are compatible with humanism could be tapped into for African higher education in this century? I mean, how do we bridge the gap between the current financing models and the decolonization and humanization agenda? I think it is important because we know, and studies have shown, that financing of higher education is gradually moving towards private financing in many developing countries. And then you also highlight the possibility of tapping into corporate entities and industrial partners, among others. I'm asking myself, how much care should be taken here to avoid going around the cycle of colonial legacy through the many multinational companies which are running the engines of most African economies? In saying so, what should be our understanding of the communal approach to funding in the context of humanized education? I'm attracted to indigenous values, but I like the way you have brought out the issue of how important it is for us to appreciate indigenous values. And if we don't do this, I think this should be our starting point. We need to appreciate and be aware of our own indigenous values, so that from there, that we can move on to look at other things. My fifth issue is centered on patience of humanism. You well bring out what you see as the major limitations of humanism, but I think I would have appreciated a pointer as to what made humanism fail in Zambia, and at the same time, what extent Kaunda's humanism as a framework deconstructed the colonial influence in education. Because when we look back, we agree that humanism made some scores. Humanism had its own limitations. So how do we bring out this reflection in order to tease out what worked and what didn't work, so that we can have a higher education that speaks to the aspirations of the African? And as a final reflection, while the key tenets of humanism are brought out, in my view, it would have been better to situate this narrative within the context of a particular African university. Yes, many of the examples are drawn from the University of Zambia as a flagship university. It would have been more deliberate to situate it in a particular African university, and not forgetting the conceptualization of African higher education. This, in my view, is important to help us to tease out the practicalities of humanizing higher education. In any case, I do acknowledge that this presentation may serve as a building block to this conversation, especially that not much has been done on the subject from an African context as opposed, from an African context. So if you're going to go with the African context as opposed to a national context, I would recommend that you engage with the work of Sipho Sepe. I'm sure you've seen that. There's an edited volume titled Towards an African Identity of Higher Education. I'm sure that volume would add one or two issues to this important conversation. In conclusion, the paper is a very timely conversation that draws our attention to begin to search for local solutions to the current challenges of higher education provision on the continent. And what is clear is that humanism was situated in a particular political, cultural, socio-economic context. And therefore, it is important to be aware of this context so that the practical lessons for forging the way forward in humanizing higher education can be clear. I also wish to commend you, Edward, for conversing with the key authors whom I deem key on the subject at hand. It was a pleasant paper to engage with, and it was also a nice presentation to listen to. Also, with that, I rest my case. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Mwale, for such a critical response. I will hand over to Dr. Mboyonga.
Thank you very much, Nelly, for such eye-opening comments. I think I might not address all your questions, but I'll just address a few in the interest of time. I know you and I will continue this conversation from here. So, yeah, I acknowledge that in the paper I said I didn't write more on the context of KK's life. I think this paper, it was sent to a conference. There was a call for papers. So mostly I just tried to align the paper with the theme of that conference. But I think there is a paper which was done some 2 years ago. It will be coming out as a second edition under CYPA, as they will be commemorating Kaunda's legacy. So there will be a paper, and in that paper, I went into details in just explaining the early life of Kaunda and how his early life had an impact on humanism. So in this presentation, I just spoke, but in passing, on the impact of religion on humanism. The critical question again is, how should we distinguish humanism from Marxism, from traditional ideologies? So in my thinking, I think humanism, it encompasses, it borrows from all these. It is a blend, so it is not socialism or Marxism as it is, but it just borrows certain aspects of socialism, certain aspects of Marxism, certain aspects of Christianity, as well as the traditional ideologies. So it is anchored on this. And probably that is also a weakness in terms of humanism, but also that gives it strength because it is not socialism, it is not Marxism, but it is enriched by getting aspects of these isms as you have put. And then an interesting question is, what does humanizing African higher education look like? I think that is a great pointer. I think if I was to relate this, I would say, humanizing African higher education or a humanized African higher education system is one which is anchored on a non-exploitation, one which seeks to promote social justice, one which seeks to promote self-reliance, hard work, and abhors corruption and other social justice ills. So that would be a humanized African higher education. Then in terms of the funding model, yes, I do very much agree with you that financing higher education is gradually moving towards private and my own PhD thesis focused on this private higher education. But my main point and my main argument is that I think what really needs to change very much is the ethics of funding and the commitment, and that is where we can borrow from humanism as well as most of the first generation of African leaders. I'll give an example. In Zambia, we had a university which was supposed to be built in Luapula province. This university was supposed to be named after the second president, Frederick Titus Jacob Chiluba. So it was supposed to be the FTJ University. Money was allocated to this university, thousands of dollars by the government. But what did we see? The money, it was there. The issue is still in court. The university, there's just a slab, just a plot that this is the university which was there. But the money which went in there, it's more than 100 million US dollars. And so I say, no, let's go to humanism. What did it teach us? It taught us issues of honesty, issues of patriotism, issues of selfless service. So if we change the ethics of funding, African higher education would enjoy a lot of funding. It's not that Africa does not have money. Africa has money, Africa has the resources, but priorities and the execution of these budgets. So that is where humanism comes in terms of the ethics of funding, prioritizing certain things. Okay, then what made humanism fail in Zambia? I think I would think of two things. One, like I mentioned in the presentation, it was heavily centered on the personality of Kenneth Kaunda. And so others, they argued that it was a way of him trying to be a dictator by hiding in the name of humanism. And the other thing is it failed because in Zambia, what happens in the Zambian politics is there is no continuity in policy. So you have this government, they will come with their own things. The next government comes, they stop. That has been the challenge. I'll give an example. When I was a student at UNZA, 2006 to 2010, 11, there was supposed to be All Africa Games. Zambia was supposed to build hostels. Up to now, those hostels haven't been done. But instead, you see, government comes, they start their own project, they leave a different project. So that has been the challenge. Okay, I think in the interest of time, I would say thank you very much for your comments and the questions. I'll take a note of them in order to improve the paper.
Thank you very much. I open the floor to question and answers for both those online and from the house. I'll start with this one.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Mboyonga, for your nice presentation. Mine is, do you think that this humanism, I mean, how far does that humanism philosophy has been achieved, specifically from Zambia and Africa in general? Can you count that, okay, maybe access to education, maybe justice or just social justice has been achieved? And if you can mention, I mean, and you can give example from Zambia context. And another thing is the issue of funding. I think that even the reviewer, I mean, the discussant mentioned that. The thing is, as you mentioned that, okay, for example, if you check on the continental level, if you go to if you dig deep on the AU budget, you find that majority of those people who are funding the AU budget, they're not even from here. So even those documents like SESA, I think you know SESA. That SESA actually is an AU document, but the one who is funding that is not from. So I think the problem starts from the continental level, that maybe we are not serious. We are good in writing, but when it comes to funding, like we think that maybe someone else should come to fund for our education system, whatever. So maybe you need to dig deep to check whether are we really funding the education? Because for us to have education for self-reliance, a humanism, you need to fund, and not otherwise. Don't expect someone from outside to fund for your own needs. Thank you.
Can I take more questions?
Yes, please.
Okay. Please.
Okay. Thank you very much, Edward, for this interesting presentation. So mine, I don't know whether should I say it's a comment or it's a question, but first I would just want to understand is in terms of having such good presentations, such interesting comments about these Ubuntu African philosophies, which are, to me, are great because they bring that kind of unity within us. So what further are we taking these cases to cascade the Ubuntu or the philosophies beyond the higher education boardrooms? Because we find that we talk about it, just all of us, we are just academics here. There is no policymaker, there is no people involved. How then should we push these agendas down to the people who are responsible to know that this is our worry, or we just write and put them in the libraries? Then we keep on arguing about this and that yet without really putting it into the right hands of people, so that such cases could then be dealt with. So then my last comment is also on, you mentioned that higher education is becoming capitalistic sort of way in fact that such principles are not really adhered to. So then it also goes back to say, what is the principle versus reality? We know that the universities have got the kinds of these Ubuntu philosophies, the inclusion and all that. What is being practiced versus what is written down? Are we really adhering to what the institutions are saying? Because I just want to also close with this quote, which says, an institution that neglects the well-being of its employees or personnel over its programmatic or economic success contradicts the philosophy or the African philosophy of Ubuntu, which adherence would include the balancing of institutional goals with the health, safety, and personal growth of its personnel, recognizing them as invaluable assets rather than mere tools for productivity and self-gratification. So I think those are my inputs, questions, and comments. Thank you.
Okay, Penela, you hand up. Okay.
I'll ask a very quick one about how you see the relationship between decolonization and humanism. So do you see the ends of decolonization as being humanism, or are you seeing humanism as something that we're doing in order to get to decolonization?
Okay, then I will read Mweme's question here. Thank you, Edward, for the nice presentation. I just wanted to hear your views on how you situate the Kaunda knowledge of humanism theory and this legacy in practice amidst various concerns about authoritarianism, limitations on political freedoms, tribalism, economic struggles, and accusations of human rights violations during his presidency in Zambia. How practical is his theory in the present Zambian political context, considering to some extent his president raised questions about the theory's effectiveness in addressing the diverse concerns of the population?
Just a quick hand from Rudo.
Okay, Rudo, you can go ahead.
Hi guys. Thank you, Edward, for the very interesting presentation. I'm so sorry I missed parts of it because my network, there's load shedding here, so my network is just funny. I don't know, maybe you answered or addressed this in your presentation, but I'm just going to shoot my question. There is a difference between Western humanization and what you are calling African humanization, but even African humanization comes from is borrowed from Western humanization. And also picking up some crumbs from Mikateko's question, to me, just because of this very link between the Western and what you're calling the African humanization, there's no relationship between colonization and humanization. They don't feed off each other in any way. But I want to know your thoughts on the limitations, because it's borrowed from the ideology of Western humanization. So Western humanization is going out there to humanize. So you're not already human. As a Black body, you need to be humanized. So this is the core of it. And when we tap into these knowledge systems, then we are tapping into this understanding that actually devalues the human. So it's a very, to me, it's a very problematic philosophy, but I just want to hear your thoughts on how you sort of like negotiate the somewhat philosophical fatalism in it. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think I'll start with the Rodol's question and link it to Prof. Mikateko's question. I think for me, I do, and this is the goodness and also the problem with these theoretical presentations. Because what one would see, someone would not see. So I think in my case, I do see a very strong link between decolonization and humanism. I do this mostly, think I've been influenced by the argument of Gansen Savelo Ndlovu, who argues that when we talk of decolonization, in its entire picture, decolonization, it dehumanized the African body and thought, it disempowered, it bodies. And to turn this around, there is need for the African to be humanized. And that is the beginning point with regards to the relationship between decolonization and humanism. And when I read, for instance, Kaunda's tenets, it was all in the effort to humanize, to bring the African identity, the Africanacity in the African in terms of values, deeds, thought, and practice. So I see a strong connection. And maybe this would answer Amika's question. I think humanism as an end of decolonization in that way. Simon, the achievement, I think with humanism philosophy, what Kaunda achieved, no any other Zambian president has achieved that. We got independence at a time when we only had 100 graduates. But humanism taught self-reliance. What do? There was no university in Zambia. The university was by then in Salisbury. So Africans from Zambia would either go to Salisbury, but again, there were politics. They were going to Fort Hare and Makerere. So we see an independent country without a university. 1964, 1966, it has a university. And most of the people who are going to the university, they went so without paying, free access. So I think for me, there was a lot of achievement, Then in terms of funding, yes, African higher education, I do agree, it is funded mostly by external forces. And that is my argument, that we need to look within, not that we don't have the resources. We do have the resources. If anything, the people who are funding us, they are still getting resources from here. The Bill Gates, for instance, they'll be investing in mines in Zambia and DRC. And that money will be used in Zambia probably as corporate social responsibility. Yet the resources are from Zambia. So we do have the resources, we do have the money. But what we need is maybe a change in ethics, a change in action. And to do that, it will be impossible without decolonization, because even the world economy is a colonized arrangement. Then taking them beyond academics, I think Chris had asked I would say yes, universities are well placed to do this. We shouldn't shy away from engaging and capturing politicians. Oliver, in his presentation, I think he said politicians want legacy and influence. So if we go to them, engage with them, they can buy into our ideas. And universities would become a better place probably, as long as it doesn't affect academic freedom and autonomy. Then principle versus reality. In Jimmy's term, I would say it's kind of a conundrum. Principle versus reality. Yeah, they like I said, there are a lot of good things which humanism achieved and also bad things. But I think if we are to build a good society, we look at the good things. And this was my message today. I do acknowledge that it's not a perfect one, but it has a lot of good things which we can learn from. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Edward, for such a great presentation. Also, many thanks goes to Dr. Mwale for responding to Edward's presentation. We are grateful. Feel free to connect even outside this platform. I think this marks the end of the presentation. We can give a round of applause.
Thank you so much.